Dr. Behe, are there limits to natural science? If so, how do they impact our understanding of origins?
There are limits to natural science. Natural science can only investigate material processes and matter and motion. And to the extent that there are other things which really exist, which are not material processes, which are not matter and motion, then science cannot investigate those things. And again, to the extent that non-physical beings or non-physical processes were involved in originating the universe and originating life or in any other event affecting things in the universe, science will have a difficult time, that is an impossible time, to investigate those. That does not mean, however, that science can't draw some conclusions. Scientists can see the physical world as it is and can make some pretty good estimations of what would have had to go into designing the physical world, and can conclude, I think, that there is no known process and that the process that was responsible for it is likely to have been something outside the universe. When one thinks of the Big Bang, one can see that perhaps something outside of the physical universe was required to initiate that. And you can extend this reasoning to origin of life chemistry and other things as well.
How does the Big Bang relate to intelligent design?
Oh, most people forget that it was only about 70 years ago or so that most scientists thought that the universe was eternal and unchanging. And then the motion of the galaxies away from the Earth and away from each other was noticed, and that was the beginning of the Big Bang theory. Now, many people have thought that the Big Bang has theological overtones. What caused this thing to occur? And many people have thought that it was the creation. If the Big Bang was the creation of nature, of time and space itself, then there must have been something outside of nature that was the cause of it. And so the Big Bang theory has really kind of ties in a number of developments from different areas of science tie in to the idea of intelligent design. This supports the idea that there is something beyond nature, beyond matter and motion. And if that thing is a mind that can act, then perhaps it set the universe in motion, and perhaps this mind, this creator, could have done other things as well. And so when we look in nature and we see things suspiciously looking like they were designed, things like the anthropic coincidences, where the charge on the electron and the mass of the proton and the gravitational constant all seem to be extremely fine-tuned, and if they were a little bit different, life simply could not have developed in the universe. When we see things like that, and when we see the irreducible complexity of biological systems, and when we see the intractability of the problem of the origin of life, all of these things reinforce each other and point strongly to the conclusion that something beyond nature, something that planned nature, was necessary for the development of the universe and life.
What are the major problems to a purely naturalistic explanation of the origin of life?
Well, for a long time, people have wondered about the origin of life. In the 19th century, many scientists thought that life, the cell, the basis of life, was so simple that it could spontaneously form from ocean mud. And that seems silly to us now, but to the science of that day, that was a good guess, but turns out not to have been true. And along with the work of Louis Pasteur, which disproved spontaneous generation, and the growing awareness that the cell was a very complex machine, theories about the origin of life kind of faded away. And they revived pretty strongly in the 1950s when Stanley Miller, a young graduate student, did a chemical experiment where he exposed some gases to an electrical discharge and showed that amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, were one of the products of the reaction. And many scientists became excited at that time because they thought, well, maybe these amino acids could spontaneously form into proteins, and maybe DNA could be formed in the same manner, and maybe the protein and DNA could get together, and pretty soon you'd have a living cell. Well, turns out that with the progress, many of these ideas were put to scientific test, and the tests have shown that the origin of life is much, much more difficult than Stanley Miller envisioned at the time, although he is a very honest man and will forthrightly admit to the problems and has done so in a number of interviews. The problem is not simply how do we get the precursors to life, it's how do we assemble them into coherent and working machinery. Let me give you a little analogy. If you think of the works of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet or something, and somebody over in the corner of the room raises his hands and shouts Eureka and says, I've just found that if you throw ink against the wall, it makes a little letter A, and sometimes it makes something that looks like an S, and I'm on my way to explaining how Romeo and Juliet was written. Well, you can see the problem that it's not getting the A and getting the S and so on, but it's putting them together into words and coherent sentences and paragraphs and more. So it has been shown that no one has been able to even come close to explaining how that information could have been put into living systems. As a matter of fact, even the chemical production of the precursors that Stanley Miller, his experiment was thought to have solved, turns out to have run into unexpected problems. The atmosphere that scientists think was around on the early Earth is not the same as Stanley Miller assumed, and the precursors would not form under these different conditions that scientists now think predominated. And the production of other things besides proteins like DNA and RNA is horrendously complicated chemically. And essentially when you put an electric spark in a mixture of chemicals, you get goop, most of which precipitates out of solution, and you get sludge on the bottom of the test tube. And many scientists will quite easily admit that science does not have any idea how life could have originated on Earth. And many more scientists then will admit that Darwinism is incapable of explaining life. They much more freely admit the problems of the chemical origin of life.
What are the odds of functional proteins arising spontaneously by strictly natural processes and integrating into complex systems?
Molecular machines are made up of a number of parts, and those parts are generally proteins. Now, most people think of proteins as something you eat, but we have found out that proteins are actually very intricately shaped machines themselves. They're made up of a string of things called amino acids. They're typically 100 to 500 amino acids in length, and they're very, very specifically shaped, so that if one protein is like this, in order to bind the protein, it's got to have exactly the right shape to fit in with another one. In molecular machines like the flagellum and the cilium and so forth, dozens of of proteins are needed to interact with each other in very specific ways to produce the function. It turns out in the past decade or so, some scientists have looked to see what is the probability of getting just one of those proteins. And it turns out to be very, very, very difficult. A man named Hubert Yockey, just by using mathematical techniques, calculated the probability of finding just one single protein to be 1 in 10 to the 65th, which is an extraordinarily low probability. It's like finding one atom in the entire, one specific atom out of all those in the entire galaxy. And this has been experimentally confirmed by a man named Robert Sauer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That is, he has confirmed that it's very unlikely for these proteins to be produced. Now, a question arises, if it's so difficult to produce one protein, how do we get molecular machines which contain dozens of proteins, all working together in very specific ways? And the simple answer is we haven't a clue. That is, Darwinian theory hasn't a clue. If the proteins had to arise independently, then the probabilities would just go astronomical, even more astronomical, very, very quickly. Another question is, in the cell replicates, but how does it replicate? It turns out that protein machines make new copies of DNA, but the DNA codes for the proteins that make copies of it. So there's this kind of circular loop where the DNA codes for the proteins and the proteins produce the DNA. How did that get hooked up in the first place? How did the DNA-protein connection get together? And again, it's a very brief answer. We don't know. There has been no experiment, even no theoretical investigation on how that could have happened, even though people have been interested in the question of the origin of life and so on for many, many years. And the very intractability of this question, I think, points to the conclusion that we're just looking at this problem wrong. We're looking at it through the wrong lens, a Darwinian naturalistic lens, and I think it might be time to take a fresh look.
For I am well aware that scarcely a single point is discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question, and this cannot possibly be here done. When did you first start having doubts about Darwinian evolution?
Well, I believed Darwinian evolution all through high school and college and graduate school because my instructors told me Darwinian evolution was true. And as a biochemist studying biochemical systems, you come across a lot of complicated cellular machinery. And sometimes I would look at it and would give me pause, but again, my instructors told me Darwinian processes produce these things, and they must have known what they were talking about. And so I took their word for it, but it really didn't have much to do with my day-to-day work as a scientist. But then when I was an associate professor at Lehigh in the late 80s, I read a book named Evolution, a Theory in Crisis by an Australian biochemist by the name of Michael Denton. And in that book, he outlined a number of problems for Darwinian theory, very serious problems, that I had never thought of myself, and none of my teachers had ever told me about. And at that point, I got mad. I thought I was being led down the garden path, and nobody was pointing out these obvious difficulties, and I was starting to wonder why. And so from that point on, I became very interested in evolution.
Is Darwin's black box a biochemical challenge to evolution, or merely a challenge to neo-Darwinian explanations of evolution?
The biochemical challenge is a challenge to Darwin's mechanism. Darwin, the idea that species are related in some manner had been proposed a century or two before Darwin, and certainly he popularized the idea, but his main claim to fame is that he thought he had discovered a mechanism whereby the great complexity of biological systems could have been produced solely by a natural, unplanned, unintelligent process. And that's really the heart of the Darwinian idea. Well, when you look at biochemical systems, you see a lot of different things that don't look like they were unplanned, don't look like they were spontaneous. They look very much like they needed forethought and intelligence to produce them. And my book, The Biochemical Challenge, Darwin's Black Box, is focused on the question of could natural selection acting on random variation have produced what we see in the cell today. And I conclude that it doesn't. And other questions certainly can be addressed by other sciences, but they don't enter into my main argument.
What have been the most significant objections to your book, Darwin's Black Box?
The objections to my book have been pretty much twofold. One is that although irreducibly complex systems can't be put together directly, perhaps they could have been put together indirectly. In the book, I use as an example of an irreducibly complex system a mousetrap. And somebody might come along and say, well, certainly you can't get a mousetrap directly by a gradual Darwinian process, but maybe the mousetrap started out as a doorstop and then turned into something else and something further. And that's possible. You know, essentially there are an infinite number of imaginary routes that you could postulate. But so far nobody has been able to come up with even one for some of the for any of the biochemical systems that I mentioned in the book. And I think the onus is on the people who propose that there are these indirect routes to show what they might be. Otherwise, we are in grave danger of letting our imaginations run away with us. The second objection, most common objection to my argument, is that, well, it's not really an objection, it's that a number of people say in the future Darwinian processes will be shown to be able to have produced these biochemical systems. And, well, you know, I have to admire these people's faith in Darwinian processes, but it's a much less persuasive argument or position to say that you think an unknown process that a Darwinian evolution will be able to be shown to have produced complex systems by in an unknown fashion. But currently we had been told up until recently that it was already shown that Darwinian processes were already known to have produced these complex systems. And so for both of these objections, it's the old, I think it's it just shows that you really can't convince somebody who doesn't wish to be convinced. And if somebody doesn't want to be persuaded of evidence for design, there are still options for them to take. But overall, in the year and a half since my book has come out, I haven't really met any good scientific objections that have made me reconsider my own position.
How do you answer those who argue that scientists cannot use intelligent agency as an explanatory mechanism?
Scientists routinely use intelligent agency as an explanatory tool. Archaeologists do it all the time when they're trying to determine whether a stone which seems to be shaped in a peculiar fashion was actually an arrowhead or just an oddly shaped stone. There was a project funded by the federal government for 10, 15 years or so called the SETI project, which stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And scientists engaged in that project used radio telescopes to scan the universe for evidence of radio signals perhaps originating from some alien planet being sent to the Earth. They were confident. Now there's a lot of radio waves in space arising from natural processes, but they were confident that they could detect an intelligently designed radio wave even in the background of natural radio waves. And so they were confident that they could detect intelligent design too. And I just think that we can apply the same reasoning to biological systems. That is, we can detect an intelligently designed purposive system just by looking at the system, realizing what the criteria are, that it has to be a functional system, that it has to be a complex system. The same sorts of criterion, altered for biology, but the same sorts of criteria that the astronomers used to see if they could detect radio waves from other planets.
Does the idea of intelligent design open new empirical possibilities for scientists to explore? Could you explain?
I think science can do a lot of work from an intelligent design point of view. It's the case in science when you get a new theory or a new paradigm, then frequently the kinds of questions that are asked differ from what was asked under the old paradigm. So, for example, Darwinian evolution would ask the question of how did natural selection produce a certain feature. In intelligent design theory, one could think that natural processes did not produce a certain feature, that it had to have been planned. But one could ask a question such as, well, what are the limits of intelligent design, or what are the limits of natural processes? To say that some things in life are designed, some very complex biological systems, is not to say that everything is designed. Certainly, perhaps the eye might be designed, but the shape of my nose might not be a matter of explicit design. So one could look at a number of molecular systems. I'm a biochemist, so that's what interests me the most. Things like DNA replication and the expression of genetic information in the genetic code, and ask, and there are a number of parts to these systems. You can ask which parts seem to have been explicitly designed, which parts seem like they may have been designed, and which parts look like they could have arisen strictly through natural processes. So that's just one feature of intelligent or one question that you can ask under an intelligent design point of view.
Intelligent design implies either natural discontinuities in the history of life, or the creation of sufficient natural laws and initial conditions to allow an evolutionary development of life on Earth. Would you discuss the strengths and weaknesses of each submodel of intelligent design?
Well, the question of how the design was executed, or where the information was put in, is a good one. And certainly a lot of people I talk to, that's one of their first questions. Did these systems have to be explicitly designed the first time they were used? Are there discontinuities where the bacterial flagellum, say, or the eukaryotic cilium, where they did not arise from an ancestor but were placed in a pre-existing system? Or on the other hand, you have sufficient information placed into life earlier and allow that information to remain unexpressed until a later point. There are strengths and weaknesses to both of these positions. In thinking that a system would be placed immediately into an animal or a plant or whatever, you have the advantage of saying that, well, that's what seems to be supported by the fossil record, by biological studies. That is, some organisms have these systems, some don't. The disadvantage, as I see it, is that you are going beyond natural processes a number of times at several points during life, and certain that's a philosophical consideration. It's not really a scientific one, but still, it's not something that science does all the time, and so one is given pause with the idea that life, that information for life in these complex processes was somehow stored into matter and later on expressed, you have the advantage of having a definite physical system that you can at least try to investigate. That is, you can mathematically see if information could be stored in an organism, how fast would it degrade, could it be stored in other structures other than DNA. You have a system that you can investigate. The disadvantage is that currently nobody knows how that information could have been stored. There are reasons to think that information might decay more rapidly than the time between its first implanting and the time it was expressed. But one might hope to get around those things. So both of those have advantages, disadvantages, but I think the bottom line is that we have to do a lot more work before we can decide between the two and perhaps even other models. So we have to get into labs and get out our calculators and start doing some honest labor here to decide between these.
Would you agree that the purpose of science is to most accurately model natural processes, even if they inhibit major evolutionary change from occurring?
The purpose of science is to describe the physical world, how it works, and how it likely got here. And in doing this, one has to try to be as faithful as possible as one can to the data. And the advantage of theories is, of course, they provide you with ideas for experiments and such. But a difficulty with all theories is that they tend to channel one's thinking in a particular direction, and sometimes you overlook important facts. One important fact that was overlooked for a long time was the fact that in the fossil record, animals seem not to change for long periods of time, and then suddenly things start to happen. And apparently many paleontologists overlooked this because in Darwinian theory it was the change that was important and nobody cared much about it. But in the early 70s, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge proposed something called punctuated equilibrium, which essentially acknowledged these times of stasis. And suddenly people started to notice them. Now the question is, punctuated equilibrium is just a label. It doesn't say what causes the stasis or what causes the rapid changes, whether or not those rapid changes actually occurred by Darwinian or other processes. One can ask oneself, well, what is the mechanism? Why do things stay the same for very long periods of time? And why do things change rapidly? Or what is happening in those periods when different animal forms are appearing in the fossil record? So I think a thorough investigation of not only the mechanisms of change, but the mechanisms that keep things the same is necessary. Unfortunately, so far nothing has been done, but hopefully in the future people will notice this and start to work on it.
Are theistic presuppositions superior to naturalistic and materialistic presuppositions within science?
Well, I think a theistic presupposition or point of view is a better stance for a scientist to assume, because theists generally think that God could have worked through natural laws or through other processes that we have perhaps less experience with. And so the question is to go out and gather evidence and evaluate the evidence and see what the evidence points to. Now, under a materialist presupposition, you have to say that unguided random processes simply had to give rise to particular features of the universe, even though those particular features look very much like they were the work of a designer. It's kind of like a person going to Mount Rushmore and looking at the faces on Mount Rushmore and saying, let's try to figure out what particular winds and erosion and rainstorms and stuff could have produced these apparently designed faces on the face of the mountain. If the scientist would open up his point of view to allow for the possibility that, in fact, those faces were designed by a purposive agent, then he would be less likely to be stuck in really defending a fairly silly proposition. Now, of course, the questions in biology and physics and so forth are perhaps not as clear to many people as the Mount Rushmore example, but I think the point remains that if you allow for if you don't confine yourself simply to material processes and let the evidence try to speak for itself, you might come to a different point of view than if you do artificially limit your options. And to that, and just for that reason, a theistic point of view, I think, is much superior for a scientist.
Charles Darwin pointed out in The Descent of Man that natural selection would act to preserve those individuals which were least encumbered with a superfluous part. Rather than argue that neo-Darwinian processes are insufficient to account for the gradual evolution of irreducibly complex systems, couldn't the case be made that natural selection would actually prevent major evolutionary change from occurring on a gradual step-by-step basis, and thus help account for the natural phenomenon of stasis?
Natural selection is certainly a real force. It will tend to weed out those organisms which are less fit. But now one has to ask the question, what will make an organism less fit? Organisms seem to be provided with a lot of molecular machinery to allow them to live and reproduce and so forth. I show a picture of a little bacterial flagellum, and the flagellum is very useful for allowing single-celled bacteria to swim through liquid and gather food and so on and so forth. Now, suppose a creature is born without some of this machinery on the level of whole organs. Suppose a monkey was born without legs or without arms or something like that. It would be at a severe disadvantage with respect to its brothers and sister animals, and would likely be outcompeted and left behind in the race to pass on its genes. However, that just speaks to preserving a complicated piece of machinery that was already there. And so, looked at it in that perspective, natural selection is a very great conserving force. Bacteria that lost their flagellum would tend not to survive. Animals that lost limbs, lost vision, lost hearing, and so forth, would also tend to be at a severe disadvantage and not survive. And so if one looks at the fossil record, one sees very great periods in which fossils of extinct creatures stay the same over long periods of time. And one can credit that probably to natural selection, weeding out the ones in which some mistake caused it to lose some of its machinery necessary for life. The big question, however, is where did that machinery come from in the first place? And right now the idea that natural selection could produce that is really a speculative hypothesis, and when one looks at it in detail, there are strong reasons to think that it cannot build, but it certainly can preserve.
Okay. How would natural selection, for example, inhibit the gradual evolution of the bacterial flagellum?
A bacterium that does not have a flagellum, there are such bacteria, and they can survive. We could ask, if a bacterium wanted to produce one, or how could a flagellum be produced on a bacterium that did not have one? Well, if it started to produce components that would later be used in the flagellum, unless they were of immediate benefit to the organism, then it turns out that natural selection would tend to weed out those bacteria because they would be using energy to produce parts that other bacteria are not producing and not getting some benefit out of them. So essentially they're burning energy wastefully, and natural selection would tend to keep those things out of the population. So it turns out that, looked in that way, natural selection not only does not help to produce a complicated, irreducibly complex machine like the flagellum, but it actually would tend to prevent it because, again, if you're using energy to produce something that is not beneficial to you, you're at a disadvantage.
If God intervened in any way in the course of natural history by either creating life originally, periodically creating basic new kinds of creatures, or reprogramming the genetic code, empirical evidence might exist for natural discontinuities. Do you regard the discovery of systems of irreducible complexity to constitute evidence for natural discontinuities?
Well, irreducibly complex systems certainly are, in my opinion, natural discontinuities. But I guess you have to understand what you mean by a natural discontinuity. I think the fertilization of an egg and the development of a new animal is pretty much a natural discontinuity too, in the sense that you have a prepackaged amount of information being released in this new organism. And the organism is built by molecular machines and a process that is not natural selection. And so in that sense, every new organism is a discontinuity. The flagellum, I think, appeared as a functional entity, briefly, maybe over a period of one generation or several generations. Whether that, that clearly is natural discontinuity. Whether that implies that the flagellum and the information for the flagellum was nowhere in nature at that point, or was in nature, had been put in nature and not activated, if you will, up to that point, is a difficult question, and I really don't have any preference either way. If it happened one way or the other, that's equally fine by me. I'm just a scientist trying to figure out how it did happen. But I think it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to experimentally decide whether the information was added immediately prior to its expression or well before its expression. But it's an interesting question that can be pursued, I think.
Could you comment further on the problem of the incipient stages of useful structures?
Darwinian theory really cannot deal with intermediates that do not have utility, because they are, first of all, very unlikely to occur, and second of all, they require energy to build, energy that other organisms are not using, and therefore the organism with this burden is at a disadvantage. So Darwinians have to postulate that each step in the building of a very complex, intricate, interactive structure itself, each of the steps was an improvement on the step before. And while if that were true, then perhaps we could agree with them that it would be beneficial to the organism and they might get this complex structure. The Darwinians rarely, if ever, flesh out what they mean by these steps. They just essentially assume that they were there. And I think at this point that now we've seen the full complexity of molecular systems, it's a time to start to ask them more detailed questions about what they think those structures were. In fact, the scientific literature contains no suggestions of what the intermediates are on the way to, say, a bacterial flagellum or a eukaryotic cilium or the blood clotting system or any other complex molecular machinery. And there are excellent reasons to conclude that, in fact, they did not exist. And those people who say that they did, I think the burden is now on them to try to flesh out their proposal so that we can all evaluate how likely it is.
Stephen Jay Gould has written that the history of most fossil species include two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. One, stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. And two, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. You seem to argue that irreducibly complex systems must appear all at once and fully formed because natural selection would not favor incipient stages of such systems. How do you see your work as confirming the discontinuous patterns found in the fossil record?
In most ways, the biochemical evidence is really pretty separate from the fossil evidence. In the past decades or so, scientists have been able to show that proteins, which are really the components of the molecular machines out of which cells are made, the structures of those, and in particular something called their amino acid sequences, can vary quite a bit, but the animals in which these proteins are contained can be pretty similar, or on the converse, the proteins can be very similar and the organisms can be very different. So to some extent there's a disjunction between the biochemical level and the level of the fossil record. In another sense, though, one can see that there, as Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge wrote, that when you look at the fossil record, it seems to be a pattern of what they called punctuated equilibrium, in which the fossils stay pretty much the same over a long period of time, and then suddenly, for some reason or other unexplained, they change pretty rapidly. Well, in the biochemical world, oftentimes you see simple organisms that do not have a certain kind of a system, and then another type of organism that has some very complex system that doesn't seem to have any precursors anywhere along the phylogenetic pathway. For example, bacteria have the flagellum of which I've spoken. Creatures with a nucleus, which includes humans and larger animals and plants and such, they don't have this wonderful machine. And on the other hand, we have a number of complicated systems that other creatures do not. And so in another way, you can look at, you can take Gould and Eldredge's idea and say that at least over a number of species, you also see equilibrium in that most species don't have a particular feature, and then suddenly in another one you seem to have a new complex system. And again, where this new complex system came from, science has been unable to explain.
Why can't microevolution be extrapolated to account for major evolutionary change?
A number of evolutionists say that microevolution can be extrapolated to macroevolutionary changes. They say things like, well, you know, the distance across a big room might be pretty far, but you take one step at a time, eventually you'll get to the other side. And by other analogies like this, they try to minimize the difficulties. The problem is that when you look at real biological systems, using the analogy of walking across a room, you see that the room is not a nice, doesn't have a nice smooth floor, but there's barbed wire, and there's landmines, and there's deep chasms, and there's walls in between you and the other side. So then the question becomes, can you just kind of walk across and get to the other side? And that's a little example from everyday life. But when you look at biological systems, microevolution is essentially small changes in pre-existing systems. You kind of like changing the color of the paint on your car or some such thing. It has not shown, it does not show the path, as far as I see, to get to completely new systems. Just because you have a blue Chevy and a brown Chevy does not mean that Chevrolets came about by undirected processes. The machines that we see in the cell are what I call irreducibly complex. And that means they have a number of different parts, and you have to have all the parts present before you get any function. So only when you have succeeded in putting together a number of parts do you get any function whatsoever. In microevolution has to start with a pre-existing function and gradually improve it. But that does not help us to explain how these systems that require multiple interacting components get together. And so a number of people, I have met a number of people who like to say that macroevolution is simply an extension of microevolution. The problem is I see a number of difficulties with that in real biology, and if they wanted to flesh out that explanation with real examples, then I think then they would be dealing with science. Right now I think it's just kind of a word explanation.
What are the best examples of the evolution of new organs, novel biological systems, or new body plans? Don't these examples undermine your argument that intelligent design was necessary?
As far as I'm aware, there are no examples of new organs, new body plans being evolved that we can confirm. As a matter of fact, speaking of body plans is the basic organization of an animal. There were in the distant past a number of body plans produced in a rather short period of time called the Cambrian explosion. And since that time, virtually no new body plans have been produced. And so the Cambrian explosion took place hundreds of millions of years ago. And so one wonders why evolution over the course of that time would not have been able to produce many, many, many more. For scientists who say that such things as body plans or organs such as the eye or the ear or whatever were produced by gradualistic processes, they simply are talking, they are simply extrapolating a long, long way from very small changes that they see in present-day organisms. They have to do that because these organ systems apparently first occurred in animals many millions of years ago. There's no experimental way that they can confirm that Darwinian processes, that natural selection, produced them. So essentially, they accept that Darwinian evolution produced them, and then they go on simply to affirm that, yes, we believe that these were produced by Darwinian evolution. It's circular reasoning. But if you look in the scientific literature, there simply is no evidence that Darwinian evolution can produce major changes in body plans, new types of organs, or any other major change.
How is intelligent design compatible with the notion of descent with modification and universal common ancestry?
Intelligent design simply says that you think a particular system was planned and put together by some intelligent agent. It does not say exactly how that was accomplished. For example, suppose that you came across a house at the bottom of a hill made of stones. And you wonder how that house was put together. And it turns out somebody, just for fun, had placed stones on a hillside in a very particular manner. And they, at the top of the hill, they pushed one of the stones down, and it hit the other one and hit the other one. They bounced off each other, and they all came together and miraculously assembled into a house. Now, that certainly is beyond most people's capability. Nonetheless, and the point I'm trying to make is that just observing that a system was designed does not necessarily tell you how the design was affected. You've got to get more evidence for that. Intelligent design, I think, is a very strong conclusion, but nonetheless, I think it's compatible, at least, with the idea of common ancestry. One example I like to give is when a fertilized egg develops into an adult animal. Excuse me. In the egg is a single cell, and when it goes on to divide, it can produce trillions of cells, all by common ancestry. They're all related to the first cell. The point is that the animal is not produced by Darwinian natural selection. There is a pre-existing program in the fertilized egg to produce the full animal. One can at least imagine that some analogous process produced life on Earth. That is, that the information for the unfolding of life was pre-existing either in some cell or in the environment or some arrangement of parts of the universe, and gradually unfolded. Of course, this would take, enormous intelligence and great power and so forth to produce. But nonetheless, if there is such a being that has that power and intelligence, then we have to assume that that is at least a theoretical possibility. Now, whether the empirical evidence and evidence we find in the future supports that or requires a more immediate production of complex components is a question for science to investigate.
If we assume that no creator was involved in the origin and history of life, then universal common ancestry simply must be true. Are there any tests for common ancestry? Or is universal common ancestry simply assumed for philosophical or methodological reasons?
When you consider origins, there are two things you have to explain: the many similarities between organisms and the many differences. Ancestry addresses the organisms. Ancestry addresses the similarities between organisms, because you can say that, well, two or different types of organisms have the same feature because they inherited it from a common ancestor. And if they did inherit it from a common ancestor, well, that would explain why both of them have it. And that's true, and that has persuaded many people. But there are two things that it's a little bit of a circular argument. And the second thing is that it's a really pretty easy line of thinking, because all you have to do is say that some feature was there and it didn't change. It was just there. Darwinian natural selection was the attempted explanation for how the differences arose between organisms. I think common ancestry, as a matter of practical fact, is taken as an assumption by most scientists today. Very few scientists are even willing to entertain the possibility that life on Earth has multiple origins. One common aspect of life that many scientists point to as a kind of a unifying feature and as support for universal common ancestry is the existence of the genetic code. Now, the genetic code in organisms is essentially identical for plants, for animals, and so on. And the scientists say that if this was inherited from a common ancestor, perhaps some simple single-celled creature a long, long time ago, then that would explain why all creatures have it. One little fly in the ointment, however, is that in the late 1970s, the genetic code was discovered to be not quite universal. It turns out there are organisms that use somewhat altered genetic codes. And one could then question whether the genetic code is, in fact, a good support for common ancestry. And I think one could still make that claim, but it's less secure than it was before. The idea of common ancestry, again, it's an assumption. I think it should not be an assumption. In science, everything should be open to question, and when new data comes about, such as the variation of the genetic code or other things, and particularly problems in embryological development, that seem to point in the opposite direction, we should try to deal with those things as honestly and as forthrightly as possible.
William Paley described God as a watchmaker. Would God be better described today as a genetic programmer or engineer?
I think every age tries to describe life and things pertaining to life in terms of the newest machinery that they are familiar with. And William Paley in the early 1800s, mechanical contrivances were still relatively new and still evoked a sense of wonderment as they should. They're really neat. And Paley then used a watch as an example of something that was designed, and then showed how a number of organisms had very complex features that would put the watch to shame, and then extended the analogy and said, just as the watch had a maker, so did the organisms. And many people today say liken organisms to, or liken DNA to, a set of computer instructions, and so they ascribe they like to make the analogy that just as a computer program required a programmer, life required a programmer as well. And that analogy I think is somewhat less charming than William Paley's analogy, but it makes the same point. And I think both Paley's and this analogy are equally valid. In any age, we see the problem of the complexity of living systems, the fact that complex systems are put together by intelligent agents, and we naturally make the association that life too required a maker.